So today, in the topic, what we want to talk about here on Stay of the Frame is the choice for making Valkyr the next Prime, or why choosing Valkyr as the next Prime, in my opinion, was the right move, where we likely were looking at Banshee Prime or Valkyr Prime, or even potentially Zephyr Prime, but I think Valkyr was the best choice in the current situation. The reason I say this, we'll return to that image in just a moment. The reason I say this is because Valkyr has been looked at twice within the past year. Basically, Warframe is changing, it's reshaping itself, and some of the frames get left behind. A perfect example is, well, not left behind, they just need some TLC. Perfect example is Zephyr. Basically, two of Zephyr's moves are kind of invalidated by the change to parkour. Parkour 2.0 basically made it so that every Warframe can fly or glide through the air wistfully, and so that kind of made her just... those two abilities don't really do too much, and so I think that obviously Zephyr is a frame that could need a look. And I also think that applies to Banshee, and I will be talking a lot about why I think that concept applies to Banshee, but not Valkyr. Valkyr basically has been looked at. But first, before we get into all of that, let's take a look at what has happened to the Prime cycle now, and why I think it is good to not go in order. And I'll return to that point probably several times in this video. So, of course, we started with Excalibur, and this one I won't go in order. I'm just going in order of the picture. This picture was from a PAX last year, and obviously it doesn't contain all of them. Ivara is here in the question mark, and then you have Inaros and Titania, and the coming Infested frame, as well as the Bard frame. So we also had Ember Prime, Loki Prime, Mag, Rhino, Volt, Frost, and Nyx and Nova. And then we got Ashe, and then we got Trinity, so already we started to fill in the blanks. And then we got Saren, and then we needed a male frame because Warframe basically likes to, or the devs like to keep it balanced, 50-50 between male and female frames. And so we got a Valkyr Prime, and then I think it was with Titania being announced or being ready for release, we needed another male frame, so we had Necros, and now we're looking at a male Infested frame, so likely there is a need for a female frame, and this left it to either Banshee or Valkyr. I had planned to do this video one way or the other, whether they had announced the frame before now or not, but what we get is Valkyr, and I think this is the right choice. The reason why I think that this is the right choice is because when Necros was announced, they also said, yeah, we're going to be taking a look at Necros and giving him some love. What they gave love to was Desecrate and Shadows of the Dead. However, I think that Terrify and Soul Punch still needed some love too, some TLC. But those moves didn't get it. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is simply resources being spread thin or time running out. It was only really a month before Necros was going to be released that they said they would tweak him and make changes to Desecrate and Shadows, and they also made changes to Shadows of the Dead. I think these were great changes, instead of having to sit there just spamming Desecrating the Dead in the ground. Now you can just turn it on, leave it on, and the Shadows are much more viable, much more of a threat, and much more of a tanking mechanism for Necros. However, when we look at, say, Terrify is a move that is incredibly hard to balance, especially with your cursed mods, some of your Uber mods, the cursed mods, because it needs duration, obviously it needs efficiency, it needs strength, and it needs range. It needs all four, but you can't balance all four. Basically, you can balance it for maximizing 2, and then it either lasts for like 8 seconds, and it's an expensive ability, or it has no range, and it's a move that actually would really be worth using if you were really capable of balancing it better. Obviously, the augment, Creeping Terrify, does make things a lot... I'm looking off screen. I really should have just put the graphic up here for you guys to see. I'm looking at the Wikia if you want to follow along. I'm trying to make these videos shorter. Anyways, let's get back into it since I'm trying to make these shorter. Creeping Terrify does make the ability more usable and easier to balance, where you basically just balance it for range and duration. However, if you were capable of balancing it for range, duration, and strength, you would be stripping enemies of armor, which is super important right now in the state of the game. And yeah, I just really think that Terrify and Soul Punch also could have used a look. And looking at Desecrate and Shadows of the Dead made him a more modern-day Warframe, and I think that these concepts also apply to Banshee. I'm going to be talking about her a lot in this video after we get done talking about why Valkyr is a modern-day Warframe, and it really doesn't come down to much. Valkyr is a modern-day Warframe because all of her moves are basically pertinent, where they have cohesion, and basically she can have multiple builds and functions within the way Warframe looks today. You look at the changes to Hysteria over the past year. Basically, it made her invincible, so what they did was they made it more costly to stay invincible. They looked at her twice and made her more balanced as far as the current state of the game is concerned. When I say balance, what I mean is, I don't mean like PvP balance, where one gun is obviously better than another because it has faster TTK or just handles a lot better. What I mean by all their moves feel pertinent and feel useful within the state of the game, whether you're using her for a Hysteria build, or say you're using her with a Warcry build where you're boosting your team or slowing down enemies, potentially combining her with, say, Nova, using Nova and Valkyr to slow enemies further, weaken them further, improve attack speed. That's the build I'm using right here in the background video, a Warcry build, a Paralysis build, where you can stun enemies, slow them down further. And it's not that Banshee doesn't have multiple builds, it's just that when you look at the way in which you build her and the way in which that compares to other Warframes, say like Warframes that have already been looked at, like Mag and Volt, Valkyr just seems like the, again, the more modern-day choice, and that is also important because you want those who grind for the Warframe, those who pay for the Warframe and its weapons, to feel like they're getting the most out of it. And I feel like jumping to these frames that are ready, that are, again, this term, modern-day Warframes, that have multiple builds, that have abilities that convalesce? No, that are cohesive with one another, that is important. And I think Valkyr has a lot more of that when it comes to being a Prime. So her Prime was basically revealed by people checking with the War Within update to see if, you know, there was a slip-up, and there was, and Val was in the Codex, or Valkyr Prime was in the Codex, along with the Venka and the Ceranos. Let's go ahead and pull up the Ceranos, and there it is. The Ceranos Prime, Venka Prime, and Valkyr Prime arrive on the 22nd, which is going to be about 3 days from this posting, 2.5, really. And so, why is all of that important, really? Because time, what DE is kind of showing us is time management, basically. They only have so many assets in people or in technology. So, like, if you look at DevStream 83, I was shocked to find out they have 2 guys who do the lighting for the entire game. That's crazy. And so, with all of the preparation for the War Within, if they announced Banshee Prime, I would have been shocked if one, she wasn't already being looked at, or two, if she wasn't looked at all, because I think they actually looked at some statistics to find that she is one of the least played frames. Now, again, this isn't to poke fun at someone's frame or poke at somebody's builds. One of the luxuries of Warframe is that all of the frames, even though they aren't in, my term of modern day Warframes, still function just fine within the game, the state of the game. Some of them just might not go as far as others, or don't have abilities that are that have cohesion between them, or some just kind of suck, like, say, Soul Punch could have really used a look at. And when it comes to Banshee, so like when we look at, say, Silence or Soundquake, these just don't look like other moves that have had these kind of fine-tunings. And we're going to start to look at other frames when it comes to what Banshee, what DE looking at Banshee might look like in other terms. So let's go ahead and start that so I can really talk about why it's going to be good to skip frames that aren't ready for their prime. So one of the first frames that I want to look at and talk about in comparison and in talking about Soundquake for Banshee is Mesa, and in particular Ash 2. Lately, Warframe has been leading more towards player involvement as opposed to these passive abilities that can be built to be uber, but really just make you do nothing. You just hit the button and it does the work for you. And so, whether Soundquake is made into continues to be a channeled move or not, it seems like what it will inevitably be is, at the very least, have more player involvement. It used to be that Mesa, you just activate her peacemakers and then you just hold down a button and win. Now you actually have to, at the very least, pay attention, move the screen around, and Ash seems like he is going to have even more involvement than that, where you have to mark a bunch of enemies and then release and go into Blade Storm, cloak, mark more enemies, release, go into Blade Storm, fatal teleport out of a rough situation. If the marking mechanic potentially is influenced by range, then from a long distance, mark a bunch of enemies and Blade Storm. So I think that what this shows us between these two frames, and even when you look at just other frames that have been looked at, modern day Warframes with abilities that have been that have cohesion, that basically says to me that a lot of Banshee's moves don't have as much cohesion. Maybe with Soundquake, if it is a cast ability, you'll move the screen around and you'll additionally cast a Sonic Boom in particular directions to add more damage. Or say, and we'll look at Volt next, but when we do, we'll talk more about this. Say, like, Volt creates Teslas between enemies, so he relies a ton on range. And also, I should comment here about how when a lot of these frames get their reworks, you're not just looking to max stats. A lot of it comes down to you have to have a lot more balance to your stats, and yet they're still powerful. Volt, you don't have to put a lot of strength on him, but by putting a lot of range on him, in fact getting him to max range and having like 130 strength, he's a powerhouse, because basically you're creating these Teslas across 10 meters, which is huge. And so I'm going to let this replay until we start talking about Volt. And the same thing goes for Saren. You have to have like this amount of balance, and she doesn't have to rely on a ton of strength, but if you go with a lot of range, you're getting all of these viral ticks from placing spores on her clone and just smashing the spores, and the spores spread because of the range. And I think that's important, because the days of, just like, oh, you just max the range and you just max the strength and there you go, those are fine, and there should be, you know, some moves that are simplified, but I think when you look at that through the scope of, like, a Soundquake build, it's a move that is limited by this notion of less player involvement. So let's take a look at that kind of lens through the eyes of Volt's rework. So one of the things I was talking about and got on a bit of a tangent with was the concept of Volt's Teslas, basically creating more damage the closer enemies are to each other, or extending that potential damage through range, where the Teslas can be created up to 10 meters, so you're just creating more damage between more enemies. And so when I think about that in concept of Sonic Boom remaining a channeled ability, I think of this concept of reverberations, where the closer enemies are to each other, the more damage they receive, because there are sound reverberations between one another, causing more damage or quote-unquote fracturing armor. And things like that seem pretty cool in concept. I think it's also worth talking about when it comes to Volt that he is not a combo frame like Mag and Saren are now, where with Mag you use Magnetize, and then you can Polarize, and then you Crush, and it really can create some damage multiplication. With Saren, you create her clone, Molt, and then you place spores on it, and then you can either destroy the spores or cast more spores and cast Miasma, and then that does even more damage because of the combination of the moves, using the Molt for efficiency in casting the spores. And yeah, Volt isn't really one of those combo frames, but his abilities have a lot more pertinence as the battle continues to go. You can use Capacitance to control and do damage to enemies, and then add shields to objects that you want to protect, or pick up the shield and then add speed to continue doing more damage on the battlefield. And I feel like even if Sonic Boom is kind of its own thing, or not Sonic Boom, Soundquake is kind of its own thing, and maybe it does combine with Sonic Boom, like I said with Mesa, where you point in particular directions and cast a Sonic Boom or hold the trigger, and it maybe sucks up more energy and does more damage. Or maybe there's the other side to it, where Banshee casts Sonic Boom, and this allows for more player agency, for more player involvement, where it's cast and then it has a duration to it, and she moves about the battlefield, and adding your... why can't I think of this? Sonar. You add your sonar to it to then add more damage to it, and you add Sonic Boom and knock down enemies, receive more damage because they have more surface area across the Soundquake, and you add Silence to it. Who knows what Silence is going to look like? I feel like Silence is one of the ones that really could use the most TLC, where, like, potentially, say, like, Sonar is balanced for range and strength, where Silence is balanced for duration and strength. So, like, Silence can be more of a control ability, whereas Sonar could potentially be more of a damage multiplying ability, where if you balance for one, you're not really balancing for the other. Say, like, if Silence was more like Mag's Polarize or Nova's Molecular Prime, where duration expands the range of it. I think these are cool concepts that could really add to Banshee being a more modern day Warframe, where you're not just, say, casting your Soundquake and then you just sit there and then you use up some energy items, some energy restores, and then you cast it again. It's not that that build is bad. It's not that it doesn't work. Again, I'm not trying to say that these things don't work. It's just when you look at frames that have received tweaks, reworks, tunings, they seem to have a lot more cohesion between abilities, a lot more function between abilities, and just, in general, more scaling. And I think that Banshee could use a bit of that time to be looked at. And I think that this is also a good notion going forward, instead of just going in order of primes. So I wanted to circle back to this, one of these first Valkyr videos, as we kind of wrap up these ideas of frames that have been given time, the resources and time at DE, and really what that means for primes moving forward. Again, when we kind of look at this old picture of the Warframes, let's go ahead and Valkyr will bring you back in just a second, and you can yell at me all you want then. When we look at this picture, there are a number of frames that could use some TLC, but there are also frames that could use, that don't need that. And maybe going in order isn't the right approach all the time. When we look at all the time and assets that were needed for the War Within, take for example in DevStream 83, where Scott had said, yeah, Limbo was placed in Limbo because his rework was placed in Limbo because all assets, all eyes were on the War Within. And so when it comes to, primes, in my opinion, they should really be up to date. They should be ready to go. When we look at Necros, Terrify, and Soul Punch likely could have used some love. And Valkyr, I think, is done needing the TLC. She was reworked or tweaked, as I say, and then even further, she had a slight retuning to make that even better, so that you just weren't always just invincible through an entire mission. And I think that's fine, and I think that works out for the best as let's say a sale, something that's going on sale, a prime that goes on sale, or something that players will put their time into to collect relics and build and feel satisfied with the result. I'm not saying that Necros was unsatisfying, but perhaps he could have been more satisfying. And when we look at Banshee, potentially Oberon, Zephyr, Hydroid, Limbo, these frames to me say they could use some of that love so that they are an all-around satisfying Warframe to farm for or to purchase if you feel so inclined. I think that Mirage and Mesa, and even potentially Atlas or Inaros, are frames that seem like they are ready to go. They really don't need much love to receive a prime. Frames that are just well balanced and have a lot of moves that function within the current game and have builds that function around each different move. When I look at Atlas, I'm like, oh yeah, you have a build that could be really focused on petrifying. You have a build for punching. You have a few builds that are for the fist flying, and you have builds for rumblers and fist flying, and you even have an augment to utilize his tectonics, although I would argue that his tectonics is probably the one ability that could use some love, but still, that's 3 abilities that can be looked at and built for and enjoyed. So really, when it comes down to it, I think that it is a benefit for the developer and for the players to bring out primes that are, again, kind of ready to go. They've been looked at recently, and if the developers are busy, say, making a story quest or making a large quest line, they can take the time to do that and have these frames that are ready to go. And when they're not working on these large quest lines, or at least not fervently working on them or steadily working on them, taking up a lot of assets in the office working on them, maybe that is a good time to say, okay, it's time for Banshee Prime or it's time for Zephyr Prime, and we're going to look at their abilities, we're going to tune them, tweak them, or possibly even give them a rework. So I hope you guys enjoyed kind of my thoughts on this, moving forward with Prime Access, releasing primes, and let me know what you think in the comments. If you like what I had to say here, do the thing, or let me know if you think that maybe there is something else to be had, another side to this argument. Again, I want to be clear that I'm not saying any of these frames are bad or don't work, or that your builds don't work. Really, I'm just saying that in the sense of the way the game looks today and the reworks and tweaks that we've seen, Valkyr is ready to go. Doesn't need any tweaks, really. And Banshee, could use a bit of love, if not a lot of love from the devs to get her ready for a Prime that feels satisfying to a great number of people. So again, if you liked what I had to say here, do the thing, and I will see you next week for another 88th Armory. We'll see if there is anything State of the Frame worthy next week. If not, you can expect it in about 2 weeks' time. Have a good one.